Today I'm going to talk about why we should be talking about more than just decreased fetal movements when we talk to women. So I'm going to include what alterations in fetal activity are significant, what's the evidence that we should be basing our talking to women about, and should we actually change the terms. So we've known for the longest time that maternal perception of a decrease in frequency of fetal movements is associated with poor pregnancy outcomes, including stillbirth, and the mechanism is thought to be to do with conserving energy. But now we've got evidence that fetal well-being is actually made up of three elements of fetal movements, that being frequency, strength, and pattern. So why should we think about strength and pattern as important elements of fetal well-being? Well, the evidence is from a number of case control studies, so let me walk you through it. The first case control study I want to talk about, although it wasn't the first chronologically, is the STAR study. And I'm talking about this first because it's a study that I was involved in. So it was an online survey conducted between September 2012 and 2014. It was a cohort study design with a nested case control arm. And what that means is that the cohort consisted of women who had experienced a stillbirth longer than 3 weeks ago, and the case control were a smaller number of cases who'd had a stillbirth but much more recently, and we controlled for what they said with women who'd had a recent live birth or were indeed still pregnant. You can read about our findings in these two articles, which were published in BMC Pregnancy and Childbirth, so it's open access, and we've tried to write as simply as possible, particularly because the Star Legacy Foundation were involved in funding this study, and we felt that we needed to be able to write our results in terms that women would be able to understand. So firstly, to the historical cohort, there's a few things to notice on this slide. The first is this no change in fetal movement. So you see that more than a quarter of the women who were involved in this study actually said that there was no change in their baby's movements in the 2 weeks before their baby died. This is important because whilst changes in fetal movement is clearly important, we need to also remember that it's by no means a absolute sign. So then we've got this large cluster of women who noticed a change in their baby's movement, moving less, and we had a number of women tell us that their baby was moving more. And it was a little bit confusing when we went to analyse these data because we did have women ticking significantly more and significantly less. So we wondered about that until we actually got to the case control data, which I'll share in a minute. So we asked the cases and the controls a number of different questions about change in their baby's usual pattern of movement over the last 2 weeks. So the question was, once you were aware of your baby's usual pattern of movement, was there any time in your baby's movements were unusual? So sorry, this particular slide is talking about the whole of the pregnancy, not just the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy. And as you can see, the difference between the cases and the controls were strongly statistically significantly different. When they replied with significantly less or significantly more, it was quite obviously very different results that we were getting between the cases and the controls. So now we're moving to the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy, and we asked the question, did you usually feel your baby moving at bedtime during this pregnancy? And as you can see, there was absolutely no statistically significant difference between the cases and the controls in answering this question about whether they usually felt their baby moving at bedtime during the pregnancy. However, there was a strongly statistically significant difference when we asked, did your baby feel your baby moving at bedtime on the last night of the pregnancy? with the cases being much less likely to endorse this than the controls, such that we see that it's actually quite strongly protective if you felt your baby moving on the last night of the pregnancy. Change in strength, we have during the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy, did the strength of your baby's movements change, stay the same, decrease or increase? And as you can see, there was a virtual polar result with the cases being much more likely to endorse decrease and the controls much more likely to endorse increase. Strongly statistically significantly different. Then we move into change in strength. And sorry, this is overlaid. But during the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy, did you feel your baby's movements change? And so the cases were much more likely to use words like less strong and weak, and the controls were much more likely to use words like stronger and harder. So not only did they endorse the drop-down menus, they actually told us in comment data in words that were obviously quite different from each other as well. So then we asked a question about change in vigour. During the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy, did you notice any time that your baby was more vigorous than usual? And as you can see, if the cases were much more likely to say yes once, and the controls were much more likely to say sometimes or often. The difference was particularly noticeable when we looked at the comment data for this response. So the cases were much more likely to use words like crazy, wild, ballistic, nuts, bananas when they talked about this change in vigour. And the controls were much more likely to use words like powerful and aggressive, such that actually there was only one control who used the word crazy, and to be frank, it sounded like she had a near miss with stillbirth, because she said, my baby went crazy, it concerned me, I went to hospital, there was something wrong. They did an emergency caesarean section. The baby was born with blue, with a cord around his neck. They resuscitated him and he's alive and well now. This tells us two things, this story. It tells us that if the mother notices this change in her baby's behaviour and immediately seeks care, she might have a short window of opportunity to save her baby. And that if we're talking about us as care providers being able to tell the difference between once or more than once with respect to vigour, then we need to listen to what the woman says with respect to how she describes the episode. So if she talks about my baby has moved in a very vigorous, powerful, aggressive way, then this is healthy. Whereas if she says my baby just went crazy, just tried to jump out of my stomach, went completely wild, absolutely ballistic, completely nuts, absolutely bananas, then these are words that may indicate a baby in trouble. We also looked at hiccups, and as it's very important to notice that this first line, did you experience hiccups? There was absolutely no difference between the cases and the controls. And this is great because it indicates that hiccups are totally normal and very physiological. So there being absolutely no difference between the cases and the controls is a really good thing. However, when we asked how long were the episodes and how often were the episodes, that's where we found the statistical significant difference between the cases and the controls, with the cases much more likely to endorse that their baby hiccuped for prolonged periods of time on a daily basis than the cases who were much more likely to say once or twice, every now and then, and of course this is totally normal fetal behaviour. So in summarising the STARS study, we see that the stillborn cases are much more likely to report in the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy a perception of decreased frequency, so that's endorsing all the other studies which have also shown that this is a risk factor for stillbirth. But we also reported weak strength as being statistically associated with stillbirth. A single episode of vigorous fetal activity described as frantic, crazy, those words, crazy, wild, ballistic, nuts, bananas, berserk. A change in pattern at bedtime and prolonged periods of hiccups felt daily. The controls were much more likely to endorse increased strength and frequency of fetal movements and sometimes vigorous fetal activity, and these were all found to be protective. And the usual pattern of movement at bedtime on the last night was also protective. So now we look and say, is this the only evidence that we have from just this one case control study? And the answer is no. We have now several studies, interestingly, pretty much the same studies that have talked about sleep position and stillbirth risk. So we'll talk about the Auckland stillbirth study first. Thomasina Stacey published these results of her PhD in 2011. And she also found that in the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy, there was perception of decreased frequency, which was not a surprise. But she also talked about weak strength as being important, that single episode of excessive vigorous fetal activity, and the controls reporting increased strength and frequency as being protective, and sometimes vigorous fetal movements, all protective. She also did mention hiccups, and because she didn't ask how often and how much, there was no statistically significant difference. So in the MINES case control study, the same one that reported on sleep position, also looked at collecting information about fetal movements. And again, they found almost exactly the same as we did, a diametrically opposed protection in increase between the cases and the controls, and a problem if there was a decrease in strength. And then the time when the baby was more vigorous than usual, again, they had that once being a problem and more than once being protective. And again, I hasten to say that although they didn't report comment data describing how these women describe this episode of vigour, it would not surprise me if they were finding the same as we did. One episode described as crazy, wild, ballistic, nuts, more than one episode of vigour described as strong, powerful. So the New Zealand multi-centred study, in summary for their particular study, which again was a follow-up to Thomasina's earlier study, but also looked at fetal movements. They also found exactly the same as the MINES and case control study from STARS, a perception of decreased frequency being a problem, as we know already, weak strength, quiet in the evening, and the controls reporting strong fetal movements in the evening, increased strength and frequency of fetal movements, and clusters or longer busy times. And I really like that description because it really helps, again, determine that difference between that single episode of crazy activity or vigour, which is described as busy times. Just looking also at when the babies moved, it's very interesting to note that, as you can see on this slide, that the cases tended to be more quiet overall than the controls, and it was particularly noticeable that the cases were quieter in the mornings and much more likely to be quiet in the evenings. So again, this supports the findings from all the other case control studies in this area that if a baby changes in strength, frequency or pattern, that you may have a problem with the baby. I just wanted to briefly say that we do have a problem if we want to continue to use the words decreased or reduced fetal movements, because these words only are focused on frequency, as both words stem from Latin words to do with numbers. Using decreased or reduced actually promotes or encourages women to count, and often that number 10 is used with respect to counting, and we know now from multiple evidence that counting to 10 is an inappropriate, inaccurate, probably even dangerous thing to do, and encourages that closed-ended question, is your baby moving, and ticking the box. It also discourages the mother from reporting other changes that might be concerning her that aren't to do with a change of frequency. So if, for example, the mother notices a change in strength that's not necessarily accompanied by a change in frequency, she might not report this worrying sign, and in fact may end up with a stillbirth because we haven't given her information about other things that she needs to be concerned about. Talking of informing the woman, the STAR study looked at asking the women what their response to their baby's behavioural change was. And as you can see, there's a huge cluster up the top here of women who either didn't worry, or mention it to their family and friends and didn't worry anymore, or mention it to their healthcare provider when we're reassured. So that's probably, the care provider who said, don't worry about that, that's okay. Or mention it to their care provider and we're told to monitor their symptoms at home and call back if they were still concerned. So that's the take a drink of water, wait 2 hours, count to 10, whatever kind of information, which is delaying response. So all of those are obviously incorrect, inaccurate, completely wrong things to do with pregnant women. This top two is the area of interest, of course, because you've got potential there to inform the woman that she actually should be worrying about a change in her baby's behaviour, and that she should be doing more than mentioning it just to her family and friends. The potential benefits of making a change to altered fetal activity are that it empowers the woman to get to know who her baby is, how her baby is, and to immediately report any change in behaviour. I really love this picture at the side. It's of an unborn baby and a newborn baby. You can clearly see it's the same baby, same attitude, same look on their face. And so encouraging the woman to get to know her baby while her baby is still unborn means she gets a head start in life in getting to know who her baby is once her baby is born. It's the same baby. It also encourages the maternity care provider to change how that fetal movement question is asked, from something like, is your baby moving, which can be answered with a yes or no, to tell me about your baby's movements, which is a much more shared care, interest kind of approach to be taken. So there are 3 elements to fetal well-being. Frequency, which we've known about for the longest time. Now strength and pattern have joined these 3 elements, all equating to fetal well-being together. So the pregnant women require education about the importance of quickly reporting any concerning alteration in their baby's activity to their maternity care provider. In order to properly assess fetal well-being, maternity care providers need to respond to any concerns the mother has about alterations in her baby's behaviour, not just a reduction in frequency. And this includes endless hiccuping on a daily basis. I'd like to thank the Star Legacy Foundation for supporting the STARS study, and here are some references that you might like to follow up.